It is March 13th, and 346 years ago today, the Massachusetts Bay Colony made a novel purchase. Boston Magazine explained in 2014. On March 13th, 1677, the imperial dreams of Massachusetts came to fruition, for on that day our colony bought Maine for 1,250 pounds sterling. At today's exchange rate, that's about $1,500. 143 years later, that investment and Massachusetts' imperial dreams would come to an end in a compromise that was highly controversial and left the new state's borders still in dispute. The story of how we made the 23rd State of the Union deserves to be remembered. The original European discovery of the area that now constitutes the U.S. state of Maine is a matter of dispute. There are persistent rumors that the area was explored by Vikings. In fact, the history of Maine, presented on the official website of the state, maine.gov, writes that 500 years before Columbus discovered America, Leif Erikson and a crew of 30 Viking sailors are believed to have explored the Maine coast and may have landed and tried to establish a settlement there. An 11th century Norwegian coin unearthed at a Native American site in Maine in 1957 might be evidence that Viking explorers made it as far south as Maine. However, it may also be the result of Native American trade network. Discovery.uk explains the fact that there hasn't been a single Norse or Viking artifact found in Maine before or since suggests that the answer to the question, were there Vikings in Maine, is highly unlikely. A 1497 visit by Italian explorer John Cabot on behalf of English King Henry VII might have gone as far south as Maine, and Portuguese and English fishermen may have been fishing in the Gulf of Maine in roughly the same era. European attempts at settlement began at least in the early 17th century with a French settlement established on St. Croix Island in 1604. The settlement, however, didn't last. Maine History Online explains, scurvy, severe cold, and shortages of fuel, wood, and fresh water caused terrible suffering. And in spring, 1605, the survivors moved their post to Port Royal on the southern tip of Nova Scotia. In 1605, English explorer George Weymouth was sent to the area in search of the supposed Northwest Passage to the Orient. In addition to exploring in Penobscot Bay, Weymouth kidnapped 5 Native American men, eventually presented 3 of the men to an investor in his voyage, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, governor of the important English port of Plymouth. The World Biographical Encyclopedia explains, Gorges took 3 of them into his house, teaching them English and learning much about their country in return. This would have significant implications for English colonization in North America. Gorges would later write, Captain George Weymouth, having failed at finding a Northwest Passage, happened into a river on the coast of America called Pemaquid, from whence he brought 5 of the natives, 3 of whose names were Menida, Selwaros, and Tasquantum, whom I seized upon. They were all of one nation, but of several parts and several families. This accident must be acknowledged the means under God of putting on foot and giving life to all our plantations. Gorges became an enthusiastic advocate of English colonization in North America, so much so that some historians refer to him as the father of English colonization in North America, although, of course, the kidnapped native men that inspired Gorges were proof that the land was occupied before the English decided to settle it, and their kidnapping would have consequences for relations between English settlers and the native peoples. Gorges became a major investor in a significant settlement near the mouth of the Kennebec River called Popham. The colony, the subject of another episode of The History Guy, found some success but was abandoned after only 14 months. Its failure, however, did not discourage Gorges. On 10 August 1622, Gorges, along with Captain John Mason, received a land grant from the Crown's Plymouth Council for New England, granting them all that part of the mainland in New England lying upon the seacoast betwixt the rivers of Merrimack and Sagadahoc, and to the furthest heads of the said rivers, and the said Sir Ferdinando Gorges and Captain John Mason, with the consent of ye President and Council, intend to name the province of Maine. This appears to be the first written example of the use of the name Maine to refer to the area, and it isn't exactly clear why the name was chosen. Gorges seemed to never have provided a written explanation. At least 4 explanations have been proposed. The most popular explanation is that the name was a reference to the French province of Maine and offered a compliment to Queen Henrietta Maria, the French wife of King Charles I. A 2001 joint resolution by the Maine state legislature supported this theory, writing, "The state of Maine is named after the province of Maine in France." But despite the legislature's approval, part of a resolution recognizing Franco-American Day, the conclusion is dubious, as Kath Gutton, author of U.S. State Names, explains. The name Maine was bestowed by Gorges in 1622, 3 years before Henrietta Maria became Queen of England in 1625. Another theory is that the area was simply seen by fishermen in the Gulf as being the mainland. While the term was quite commonly used, it's unclear why it would be applied only to this particular piece of land. It may have been a reference to the Orkney Islands, where Mason had served in the Royal Navy. The main island in the Orkney Islands was called Mainland. But Gutton prefers an explanation advanced by Maine historian Carol B. Smith Fisher, that the name is a reference to the ancestral home of Gorges, a village in Dorchester, listed in the Domesday Book of 1086 as being called Maine. Thus, Gutton notes, the implication derived from Smith Fisher's theory is that just as Gorges's ancestors settled in, or perhaps even founded, the town of Maine in England upon their arrival from France in the 11th century, so did he establish the colony of Maine in North America for the further propagation of the Gorges family. Simply put, none of the theories have been proven, but when the charter was confirmed in 1639, it included the stipulation that it shall forever hereafter be called and named the province or county of Maine, and not by any other name or names whatsoever. In 1629, Gorges and Mason divided the land, with Mason getting the section to the south, which he named New Hampshire, and Gorges's portion retained the name Maine. Gutton writes, while they initially had little success in colonizing, Gorges and Mason took pains to maintain control of their patents and land grants in New England. Despite his enthusiasm, which included investing a significant portion of his own wealth, Gorges would never see the land he named. A royalist in a time of increasing tensions between the king and Parliament, he was constantly subject to investigation by Parliament. In 1635, Parliament disbanded the Plymouth Company. In his 2010 book, Hidden History of Maine, author Harry Gratwick writes that Gorges lamented, "I have spent the flower of my life in promoting new settlements on a remote continent." When Gorges finally made plans to cross the ocean to see these lands in 1645, Gratwick writes that as his ship was being launched, it rolled over on its side and broke apart. Fernando Gorges, he writes, who had devoted 40 years of his life to colonizing Maine, was never to set foot on its shores. He continues, with the coming of the Civil Wars and the fall of Charles I, Sir Fernando's world fell apart. He died in 1647, a broken man of almost 80. The next year, the king was executed. His death, however, was seen as an opportunity in the New World. In his 1970 work, Maine Becomes a State, the movement to separate Maine from Massachusetts, author Ronald Banks explains, not only did the triumph of Cromwell kill this dream of Gorges, it also produced a power vacuum in Maine, into which the avaricious Puritans of Massachusetts Bay were only too anxious to rush. Boston Magazine writes, shortly after his death, Massachusetts struck. Gratwick writes, in 1652, with Gorges no longer around, the colony's leaders in Boston decided to seize the moment. Massachusetts Bay revised its charter and extended its boundary eastward to Casco Bay. Shortly after this, the boundary was extended to Penobscot Bay. Maine had been absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But, Boston Magazine notes, like any occupation, this didn't necessarily go over well with the settlers of Maine, or leaders in England, to say nothing of the Native Americans. Massachusetts, however, settled the issue on March 13, 1677, purchasing Maine from Gorges's heirs. The deed states, "The said Ferdinando Gorges, for and in consideration of the sum of 1,250 pounds of lawful English money, doth grant bargain and sell all that county, palatine, part, portly, or portion of the main land of New England aforementioned, called or known by the name of the province or county of Maine." And Maine, still remote and sparsely populated, remained part of Massachusetts. During the Revolutionary War, Maine.gov explains, because of Maine's remoteness from the authorities in Boston and the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the inhabitants received little military support, despite the proximity of the British across the border in Canada and constant pressure from the Royal Navy along the coast. While there were conflicts in Maine during the war, Maine.gov notes, the war for American independence was successfully fought and won elsewhere. The war, however, did aid the future U.S. state in a significant way, Guyton writes. During the American Revolution, the English had numerous designs on Maine, one of which proposed taking the territory between the Saco and the St. Croix rivers and calling it the province of New Ireland, and then making it available to loyalists escaping from the rebellious colonies. But the plot came to nothing, and the Paris Treaty of 1783, which ended the war for independence, ended also any claim of the English to the province of Maine. The Paris Treaty would again rear its head, but Maine, which after the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 was partitioned as the Massachusetts District of Maine, was firmly a part of the new nation, if only as a remote district of Massachusetts, far from Boston. Banks writes, "The American Revolution, nevertheless, proved to be a watershed in the history of Maine. With the Treaty of Paris concluded in 1783, the district, no longer harassed by wars, embarked on her first period of sustained growth and development. Between 1784 and 1820, the population increased some 450%. Maine had a large availability of land, and settlers flocked to the area. But with growth came discontent," Banks writes. "Clearly many believed that Boston understood but very little of the peculiar nature of the problems that Maine people faced. Agitation for separation from Massachusetts began as early as 1785, Banks notes. January 1st, 1785 saw the first number of the first newspaper printed in the District of Maine, the Falmouth Gazette. According to William Williamson, Maine's noted historian, Benjamin Titcomb, the scion of a well-to-do Falmouth family, and Thomas B. Waite, formerly associated with the Boston Independent Chronicle, founded the Gazette for the purpose of promoting separation. Various committees and conventions were convened, supporting independence over the coming years. The breaking point, however, came as a result of the War of 1812, Maine.gov explains. The seizure by the British of the entire coast of Penobscot Bay further deepened the economic hardships of the residents of Maine. The Massachusetts legislature refused to take any action to relieve or defend Maine, and instead improved their own fortifications. The New England Historical Society writes, Governor Caleb Strong refused to send Massachusetts militiamen into the fight. He left Maine on its own. The British captured Castine, Belfast, Eastport, and sacked Bangor and Hampden. While the Treaty of Ghent, ending the war, re-established the boundaries of the 1783 Paris Treaty, Maine.gov writes, the most important result of the War of 1812 upon the citizens of Maine was that it fanned the movement for independence from Massachusetts. This had been a growing issue before the war, but the utter failure of Massachusetts to assist the District of Maine in any way brought the matter to a head. William King, who had been in charge of the Maine militia, became the principal leader of the drive for statehood. But there was an obstacle: the coasting law of 1789. The New England Historical Society notes, coasting vessels, typically schooners, hauled cargo up and down the coast, much like trucks today carry freight on the interstate. The 1789 law required coasting vessels to clear customs in every state except the state next door. As a part of Massachusetts, Maine coasters didn't have to clear customs until they reached New Jersey, a considerable advantage to Mainers. If Maine were to separate, coasters would have to clear customs in Massachusetts, a costly and time-consuming prospect. As a result, 2 votes on the question of statehood failed in 1816. The New England Historical Society continues. William King realized the coastal towns voted against statehood because of the 1789 coasting law. Maine statehood would hurt Maine shipping and shipbuilding. Fortunately for William King, he had a brother, Rufus, a U.S. Senator from New York. Rufus King and other allies in the Senate managed to revise the coasting law. And so, on July 26, 1819, Maine took its 6th and final vote for statehood. A total of 17,091 voted for full Maine statehood versus 7,132 for remaining a province of Massachusetts. Massachusetts could hardly resist the vote. The website Mass Moments explains, although its pride was wounded, the Massachusetts legislature conceded, reluctantly passing a statehood bill for Maine in late 1819. There was only one condition. Statehood required the approval of Congress and the President. If statehood was not approved by March 4th, 1820, Maine would remain a part of Massachusetts. But then a twist. Missouri had also applied for statehood in 1818, and it was clear that the population of Missouri would vote to be a slave state. Maine statehood became tied to Missouri's. To maintain a balance of power in the Senate, Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, only if Maine was admitted as a free state. Mass Moments continues. Mainers had begun campaigning for statehood in the years following the Revolution. The Massachusetts legislature finally consented in 1819. What no one in either Massachusetts or Maine foresaw, however, was that Maine's quest for statehood would become entangled in the most divisive issue in American history: slavery. Most Mainers supported abolition. They were dismayed that their admission to the Union was linked to the admission of Missouri as a slave state. Despite their long struggle for independence, when the vote came, the website of Bowdoin College explains, 5 of Maine's 7 congressmen, Martin Kinsley, Joshua Cushman, Ezekiel Whitman, Enoch Lincoln, and James Parker, wanted to prohibit slavery spread into new territories. In 1820, they voted against the Missouri Compromise and against Maine's independence. But to no avail. The compromise passed. Mass Moments writes, Massachusetts lost over 30,000 square miles of land as its former province of Maine gained statehood. Statehood came on March 15, 1820, 143 years and 2 days after Massachusetts had purchased Maine from Ferdinando Gorges's heirs. But there was another problem. As population and lumbering moved north, there was a conflict over the border. The source of the problem was the 1783 Treaty of Paris. The website Maine History Online explains the negotiators who drafted the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War had failed to specify a clear boundary between Maine and New Brunswick. But while the disputed territory remained unsettled, little thought was given to defining it. When residents tried to incorporate a town in the disputed territory in 1830, New Brunswick raised militia. But under the Treaty of Ghent, a neutral third party could be used to resolve border disputes. The U.S. and the U.K. agreed upon King William I of the Netherlands, who found the description in the 1783 treaty to be inexplicable and impractical. William proposed a compromise, but Maine opposed it. The history website EarNow explains Maine responded by changing its strategy. It now maintained its boundary claims were part of a larger national issue, states' rights. This was an odd shift. Maine had taken the position of the slave states it had opposed in 1820. EarNow continues, by aligning itself with slave states that were asserting states' rights to resist federal restrictions on slavery, Maine succeeded in getting the Senate to reject the Dutch king's decision. Without a compromise, the situation slowly escalated as both sides tried to claim timber rights. By 1838, both sides were raising militia. Congress authorized the raising of 50,000 troops should U.S. territory be invaded. Armed conflict was only avoided by the arrival of U.S. General Winfield Scott, who managed to convince the militia to draw back as the two governments negotiated a compromise. The bloodless near-confrontation became known as the Aroostook War, after the Native American name for the disputed area. While there was no shooting, 38 militiamen were known to die in the war of accident, exposure, or disease. In the end, the United States Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, negotiated a compromise with the British diplomat Alexander Baring, the first Baron Ashburton. EarNow credits Webster's legendary political skills with convincing Maine to accept this new compromise. He anonymously inserted stories into Maine newspapers that made it sound like this compromise was actually Maine's idea, and he threatened the governor of Maine with a map that had supposedly been drawn by Benjamin Franklin during the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris, which supported the British view of the border and made it look like this new compromise was actually operating in America's favor. In the end, the treaty was accepted by all. It was signed on August 9th, 1842. Ironically, this new deal gave the United States some 900 square kilometers less land than if it accepted the original compromise that was offered by the Dutch king, William I. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.